I just want you to pause and have a look at this slide for a second or two and think about how it makes you feel about me. As you can see, what it should really look like is something like that. But if you start off with something like a slide full of typos, at the very best, you might be charitable and say, oh, she must have done it at midnight last night. But if you're feeling uncharitable, you might think, well, this is a sloppy person. I don't really think I'm going to give her £1 million to do her research project. So it's just an example of how first impressions really do count. So I'm just going to go through some tips really about writing. I don't think we're told enough about these sorts of things as researchers, but they do change the way you approach writing a grant. At the beginning, I said a grant or a research award application is different from a research paper. It's different from a research protocol. None of these are really pitching as a sales pitch, and I think you know, that kind of way in which one writes for a paper is really very different to how one writes for a grant application. And this session hopefully will give you a number of tips about how to rethink the way you write your applications to really get your ideas across and to get reviewers on board. I thought it might be helpful if I start with some tips from the top. So some really great writers and what they say about writing. Okay, we all know that the first thing that we draft out is not particularly good, and we need to work iteratively on it to make it something really sparkling and great. One day I will find the right words and they will be simple. Jack Kerouac. Again, we've already heard from our panelists the importance of understanding a plain English summary and the general clarity of writing. Trying to write simply for a grant application where you can do it is tremendously helpful. Yes, you're often working in technical fields and there'll be technical words that you have to use, but if you do have that, then explain them to your audience. The first sentence of book is like a handshake, perhaps an embrace. Again, this idea of the first thing that you read should draw you in, it should interest and excite you, and not put you off. But for my own part, if a book is well written, I always find it too short. So engage the reader through your writerly skills. You know, write something compelling and interesting that they want to read more of. Fill your paper with the breathings of your heart. I mean, that sounds tremendously romantic, doesn't it? But in fact, with certain sorts of grant applications, in particular those for personal awards like fellowships, getting across an element of your enthusiasm, your personality, can be an important trick or an important thing to do. Not overboard, but in an understated sort of way. I can only write with authority about what I know well. So Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Again, it's a sensible thing. You're not necessarily going to apply for a grant in an area that you know nothing about. The exception for that may be if you're applying for a doctoral fellowship, and you know it's an area that you have some background in, but are not necessarily an expert in. When it comes to other research grants, you have to show that you pretty much know what you're talking about, and you can demonstrate that by showing what you've looked at in terms of reviewing previous literature and your own research track record. You can't rush inspiration, Colson Whitehead. So again, another tip really about not rushing when you put a grant application together. Really think carefully about what you're writing and take time to do it. From Bernadette Evaristo, don't be crushed by other people's gatekeeping. That said, take a good look at your work and make sure it is publishable and is going to stand out. So yes, research funding panels are gatekeepers, but take a look at what they say. You know, if they do have some feedback, take it on board and make sure that next time you put it is in inverted commas publishable, and it's something that they do want to take on board. I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by. Douglas Adams, I'm sure you've all heard of that one. Now, how should we interpret that? I think in two ways. One, yes, there are deadlines and you have to make deadlines, but if you're not ready, let it whoosh by. Let it whoosh by, because invariably there will be other calls. Most schemes have regular calls, and you can always apply next time, unless, of course, you've got a particular urgent need to get a grant in at a particular time. But let those deadlines whoosh by if necessary. Just going to flag again that a lot of this information comes from the Research Funding Toolkit. So if you want to get hold of that or read it, Darrington also has a blog, which I'll talk about at the end, which can be helpful. So just to remind you of the four key propositions: the importance, success, value, and competence propositions. And these are the things that you're talking to in your grant application. Now, there are lots of challenges. There are lots of challenges in writing grant applications. Rigid templates, and we all know the pain of page limits and word counts. We all know how difficult it is to get complex ideas across in a small number of words. But these are skills that we have to hone, and we do have to try our best to get succinctly across the important things that reviewers need to know. We've already mentioned the importance of the right information at the right place. So if a reviewer is reading your application, if you remember what Izzy was saying, and they've just thought with a big thought bubble, ooh, what about generalizability? The next sentence will mitigate that thought. So basically the reviewer will happily read on, and there'll be no niggles left in their head at the end for them to attack you with when it comes to the panel discussion. Bear in mind, and again, you've heard from Izzy, the types of people who sit on funding panels and the types of peer reviewers who might be looking at your grant application. So some of them will be specialists, in particular those peer reviewers. So if your stage 2 application has been sent out to an expert peer reviewer, you do have to write in a way that they will feel that all the bases are covered. But at the same time, you have a large number of non-specialists that you're writing to. So those generalist scientists, those methodologists who are sitting on the panel, who need to understand what it is you're talking about without perhaps having that expert knowledge. So your specialists are likely to be detailed readers. They're going to go in depth and look carefully at what you've written, but there'll also be a lot of people who are speed reading. So for them, you need to write in a different way, and they need to pick up all those important points, even if they're reading really quickly. So they need, as a whole, clear pointers. They need relevant information. They don't want any waffle. They need arguments that will appeal to the funder, so not necessarily your discipline. So as I said, you may have a brilliant academic niche, but if it's not of interest to the funder, they don't want to hear about it. They want to hear arguments that relate to things that they consider to be important. And you need sufficient detail to assess quality and feasibility. And we all tear our hair out at the difficulty of getting that balance when you've only got, X number of words to actually do it. I think one of the things that's important is the overall structure and what I call symmetry, I suppose, of a grant application. And we heard a little bit about this from Limi, who talked about the importance of consistency in a grant application. So if we look at the dictionary definitions of structure, so the existing arrangement and mutual relation of the constituent parts of material object, that might relate to the aeroplane I was talking about. You have the different parts, but they relate to each other and they're all important. And in symmetry, due or just proportion, harmony of parts with each other and the whole, fitting, regular or balanced arrangement and relation of parts or elements, the condition or quality of being well proportioned or well balanced. And again, if you are going to talk about aims and objectives in one section, we don't want to see those morphing into a different set of aims and objectives later on in the application. We need that structure and we need that symmetry in a grant application. I think probably at the heart of any grant application are the aims and objectives. So these are the things, the pumping heart, that are driving all the things that you're writing around the thing that you're trying to do. So it will be reflected in the title. It will be reflected in the plain English and scientific summaries. It will be reflected in the background and rationale. And that is the opportunity to, justify why you are doing, looking at these various aims and objectives. They will be reflected in the research plan and methods. And in fact, quite a handy tip is that you can pick up your aims and objectives, you can dump them in the method section and work to them. So you're making sure that that consistency is there. They will be reflected in the outputs and impact of your work. They will be reflected in the expertise that you choose, because if you're going to do something statistical, you need a statistician on the team. It will be reflected in your choice of patient-public involvement. So if it's for a particular topic, such as diabetes or mental health, you would want to have people with lived experience of these conditions. And it will be reflected in your budget, because obviously you're going to have to fund everything that you need to achieve these aims and objectives. So I think you need to look and check that those aims and objectives are reflected in all the different sections of your grant application. Story. So we've had symmetry. Now we have story, and this is an extremely important part of your application. And I think perhaps often neglected. I think people do tend to think, oh, well, if we've got the methods right, everything's fine. But in fact, the story is important, because if you can't tell a good story, people will get that so what question welling up in their minds. And where do we see the story? Well, we see it in the background and rationale to the study. We see it in the summaries. So people can pick up easily what the story is, why what you're doing is important. What are your tools? Well, your tools are firstly the literature, and you'll have the opportunity to do a review of the literature of some sort. Now, there are lots of different methods of doing literature reviews. Most of them have some systematic element to them. Sometimes we talk about scoping reviews, sometimes we talk about narrative reviews, but they all have some process and structure to how you go about them. And it's certainly worth talking to your local healthcare librarian who can help you do these sorts of reviews that will pick up on evidence that's already out there that will help you construct your story. So these reviews are terribly helpful. You can do a review. If there isn't a review out there, it's worth you doing a review. And obviously there are the primary research papers that feed into those reviews. And sometimes it's important to look at other literature, such as grey or unpublished literature, depending on your topic area, to feed into your story. We talked a little bit about prior work. So in a sense, that's part of your story. So at the back end of your background section, you may have work leading to this project, and that might include prior work that you've undertaken or relevant work that you've undertaken, which might be pilot or feasibility work, or the development of a prototype for invention for innovation application, for example. And the other tools you have are the way in which you use the language. So the style, the argument, and the coherence of your argument can have a massive impact on how people interpret and understand the importance of what you're trying to do. So let's think for a moment about what the argument is. And if you look at any background section in a grant proposal, it actually follows quite a familiar pattern. Firstly, there is a statement of the problem, and this is usually supported by some sort of evidence. So it might be evidence of the prevalence or incidence of an illness. It might relate to poor patient outcomes or costs to the NHS or society of a particular problem. It'll also state that its resolution could improve many things. So it could reduce the incidence or the prevalence, it could improve patient outcomes, or it could reduce costs to the NHS or social care. It will usually say something about previous work. So previous work has shown this, that, and the other, but it's deficient in the following ways, X, Y, and Z. And that is your knowledge gap, and that is the knowledge gap that you're hoping to fill by undertaking this piece of research. You're then stating that this project will address the knowledge gap. So it will resolve the uncertainty, or it will provide the necessary information or the solution to the problem that you've posed. And then you're stating when this project is done and the problem is resolved, the impact of this will be. And you're saying it's going to make a massive difference to patients. It's going to save the NHS loads of money. And you'll find that those 5 points are in most background sections one way or another. Just to show you that you can create this for almost anything, I'm going to have a bit of a laugh and talk about Star Wars. So a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, we've got a study here to evaluate the impact of Jedi Force staff training on the mortality and morbidity associated with the dark side. And just to be in true spirit of an academic, I'm going to give it a slightly wacky acronym. So the dark side is a problem. It causes death in large numbers of people every year and has been known to exterminate whole planetary populations. In addition, it causes much anxiety and depression. The costs are enormous, both for victims, but also in rebuilding lives and civilizations affected. Removal of the dark side would be beneficial to many millions of people. It would reduce suffering and death and reduce costs to the NHS and other health and social welfare organisations. Current approaches to remove the dark side, such as attacks by small numbers of disorganised rebels, have failed. There is a clear need for a more radical and magical solution. Preliminary studies indicate the potential of forced training for Jedi Knights in tackling the dark side, but its full efficacy and effectiveness is unknown. This project will evaluate whether or not forced training of Jedi Knights is effective in fighting the dark side. If this approach is found to be beneficial, the dark side may be successfully defeated, with resulting improvements in quality of life and longevity throughout the galaxy. That is, of course, until another Jedi Knight goes AWOL because they're not terribly reliable. So if we look more seriously at an applied health example, and this is a real research application, obesity has led to more type 2 diabetes, which causes morbidity and premature mortality. It costs the NHS a great deal. So what we're saying there is obesity is a problem in this particular group. Reduction in obesity in those with obesity and type 2 diabetes would reduce complications, even resolve diabetes. Its resolution would improve many things. Current guidance for those with non-morbid obesity and type 2 diabetes suggests exercise, behavioural changes or drugs. These have limited effects. Preliminary studies show the potential of bariatric surgery for those in this kind of interstitial zone and type 2 diabetes. Results need confirming for the non-morbidly obese type 2 diabetes group in a larger trial, but we don't know if this is feasible. So previous work has shown we need better interventions, that bariatric surgery is a possibility, and we need a trial, but we don't know whether a trial is feasible. A feasibility study will enable us to see if bariatric surgery is logistically possible and acceptable to this group of patients and their clinicians. So this project will show whether or not a trial is feasible. If this is successful and a definitive study shows it works, bariatric surgery could provide a cost-effective solution for this group. So if a trial is possible and is undertaken and bariatric surgery works for this group, we will have a solution. So those same 5 points coming across. Does it work when you don't have an intervention? Yes, it does. So currently the inpatient care on offer for children and young people with severe mental health problems is variable, and where they end up on adult wards, unsatisfactory. So there's unsatisfactory care for children and young people with severe mental illnesses, and it's a problem. Improvements in care would lead to better patient outcomes and resource use. So the resolution to this problem would mean better care, better use of resources. Currently, we do not know how patients fare, whether different settings affect patients' progress, and the cost implications of these settings. There is little prior work on how different settings affect outcomes and costs for this group. This project will provide information on patient experiences and the costs of different patient pathways. This project will give us that information. This information will be vital to those for ensuring that young people have access to high-quality inpatient care when needed. It will also help staff in local services to make better use of their beds. This study will provide the much-needed information to plan better services. So even if you don't have an intervention, you're still using those 5 main points to get your argument across. When we're writing the story or background section to our applications, and indeed our whole applications, we use what we call convincing and defensive arguments. So a convincing argument are a bit like the ones I've just stated in those examples. They're supportive and they're the things that you want reviewers to remember. But we also use defensive arguments, and this basically deals with this problem. And so you forget about them as reviewers. So if you imagine Izzy with a thought bubble, what about the generalizability of this study? The next sentence says, although we're only collecting data from these 2 counties, data from ONS show the socio-demographic profile to be very similar to national averages. Results from this study should therefore be generalizable to the broader UK population. You've answered the bubble in her head. She forgets about it and she moves on to the more important bits of the application. So these are convincing and defensive arguments, so make good use of them. It's important to add emphases and to refine your arguments, and it's a good way to do that is to use connectives. So in contrast, the majority, remarkably, in conclusion, undoubtedly, it appears, in spite of, consequently, as well as, however, all these are really useful linking words, and I'll talk about that later, that will help us construct an argument. The story should pack a punch, so use the literature to define the problem. Use the literature to justify why this research is necessary. Also use it to provide evidence of best design. Show how the work fits the remit, and put it all into a logical, convincing argument. By the end of the background section, you want reviewers to be saying, why haven't we done this before? Or, my gosh, we really do have to do this work. So that's the kind of effect you want to have on your reviewers. Well, how do you fit it all on the form? Again, the difficulty of small word counts, but we have to do our best. Now, again, the forms have changed slightly for NIHR in that they, for stage 1 forms, they're no longer giving you strict headings, but they are giving you bullet points that fit really across the old headings that they used to have. So these are the sorts of areas that you'll cover in your background section in an NIHR application. Firstly, a bit of scene setting. So what is the problem being addressed? So you're defining the problem. You're looking at, you're saying what the impact is, you're saying how the research will fill the evidence gap and how the research fits the remit of the scheme. Why is this research important in terms of improving health or well-being of public patients, care and health services? Again, you're pointing out the importance for patients, service users and public. And to be honest, it's quite sensible to have subheadings of your own saying importance to patients, importance to NHS and social care services, anticipated outcomes and impact, pathway and timescale to patient benefit. So these are the sorts of things they're looking in what would have been their old middle section. And then they're asking for a review of existing evidence. How does the existing literature support this proposal? So you're providing evidence for the need and rationale to the work. You're talking about past and current research justifying the work. They ask you to add distinct value. They want to see something new being added to the literature. Hopefully there'll be a systematic review out there. If there isn't, you want to do your own, or you may want to update one if it's a bit out of date. Some sort of systematic review, and I know they vary. And you want to talk about the prior work of the team. So that might be pilot or feasibility data or other work that you've done leading up to the project. Now, that looks quite straightforward, but in fact, if we look at these headings, you can see there's the potential there for overlap. So how you manage these paragraphs, of course, having the free rein now in stage 1 may make this a little bit easier. But you can see that it's important not to repeat yourself in different sections. I find actually for that first section, sometimes it's quite good to get a really succinct pitch in there. So you're not necessarily going into a lot of detail, but you're stating very clearly what the problems are, and you're going to a bit more detail in the second section about why it's important. The other sorts of things in that middle section would be, well, who says it's important? There may be policy documents or James Lind Alliance prioritization exercises has been done that demonstrate that other people are agreeing with you that this area is important. And then you're basically going through the literature in a systematic way, but building an argument as you do so, so that by the end of the section, everyone can see that you've put a really good case forward for the work that you want to do. And again, how the evidence will fill the gap. You could see there's a potential there for overlap if you're using the old 3 sections, which, as I say, we're kind of moving on from there, but they were put there in the first place to try and make sure that all the bits of information that they like to see are included. So when it comes to the story, remember to use the force of argument. It'll help you no end. So we've done symmetry and story. We're now going on to style. Importantly, keeping everything easy to read. And we've already heard from panelists how important it is that you write in a way that's clear and understandable. Now, Bernard will be giving some excellent tips later. How plain is your English is his presentation, and that's coming up. So I'll skate over some things and he'll be going into more detail into others. But it's important at the end of the day to get your headline messages across. You don't want your reviewers going down a rabbit hole of convoluted arguments. So be quite cruel with yourself, dispense with unnecessary information. Use your adjectives sparingly because they tend to slow the reader down. They're sometimes valuable for factual qualification, but avoid sort of subjective words like exciting and profound. Let the reader see what you've written, look at the evidence that you've given them, and to know as a result of that, that is exciting or profound. And use adverbs even more sparingly. So here we have a literary interlude, a lovely piece of writing by Arundhati Roy. May in Imeman is a hot brooding month. The days are long and humid. The river shrinks and black crows gorge on bright mangoes in still dusk green trees. Red bananas ripen, jackfruits burst. Dissolute blue bottles hum vacuously in the fruity air. Then they stun themselves against clear window panes and die fatly baffled in the sun. So what glorious writing. And when you read it, it creates such a thing in your mind about this hot, humid day with flies buzzing around. You don't want your grant application to look like that, though. This is brilliant for creative writing where you want people to visualize a whole scene, but at the end of the day, you don't want reviewers to be distracted by beautiful writing. You want them to get to the nub of your argument. Do not use typography to emphasize too much text. Now, generally, if you've got something important to say it at the beginning of the sentence, paragraph, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. If you have a piece of bold text in the middle of a paragraph, it's actually very off-putting to speed readers because they'll pick up on that, and in the middle of the paragraph, it's probably likely to be quite meaningless or out of context. So if there is something important, put it at the beginning of the paragraph. So be careful with how you use typography. Make use of bullet points and numbered lists. That can cut down on your words. Use short paragraphs and short sentences and simple punctuation. So if you find colons and semicolons sneaking in there, dispense with them. Another lovely piece of writing, which I'm going to read with a deep breath. In consideration of the day and hour of my birth, it was declared by the nurse and by some sage women in the neighbourhood who had taken a lively interest in me several months before there was any likelihood of our becoming personally acquainted, first, that I was destined to be unlucky in life, and secondly, that I was privileged to see ghosts and spirits, both of these gifts inevitably attaching, as they believed, to all unlucky infants of either gender born towards the small hours on a Friday night. That is one sentence. Is actually the first paragraph and indeed the first sentence of Dickens's David Copperfield. You know, you don't want to write like that. You don't want to write that like that because it's too convoluted. Again, as fictional writing, it's marvelous, but as you know, writing and getting your idea across and your ideas across quickly, it's not the best approach. However, if we look at this, outside there was not a sound. The house had never been this quiet before. All was silent. From her bed, Stella turned her head to look out of the window. This is Williams's awful auntie. And my advice to you, write like David Williams because short sentences to the point, and that's what we want. So I've got a little exercise for you to do so you can have a little break from me wittering on. This is yet another first sentence and indeed paragraph from a very well-known, lovely piece of fictional work, Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery. I want you to spend a few moments having a go at reworking that in a Walliam style. I'm going to have a go at that myself so you can see perhaps what it should look like, but I'm sure you've done something very similar. So you'll see what sorts of changes that have been made. Lots more full stops. So Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, full stop. The hollow was fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, full stop. It was also traversed by a brook, full stop. The source of the brook was away back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place, full stop. The brook was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade, full stop. By the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, however, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, full stop. Not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum, full stop. It was probably conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, full stop. She was no doubt keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed from brooks and children up, full stop. If she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. So that's my interpretation of a Walliam-style Ellen Montgomery, first paragraph of Anne of Green Gables. I'm sure you've got something very similar, but it gives you an idea of how if you have short sentences, everything becomes a lot simpler, and you don't end up disappearing down rabbit holes. So still trying to keep it easy to read, we had a comment this morning from Mara about dense text. And I think one of the things that we can do quite easily is making sure that our text isn't dense. Again, it's terribly tempting, isn't it, when we've got limited words to stuff as much as we can in the smallest font size possible with as few gaps as possible. But in fact, it's very counterproductive because reviewers get really annoyed when you do that. And you will find that most funders will stipulate how many pages or what font size you should use just to avoid that. So have breathing space in the text and use subheading. So here's an example from a CDF that was funded a while ago. Clearly, that kind of dense text is going to be a problem. As soon as you pop in spaces, it looks more palatable. If you then help with subheadings to guide, especially those speed readers, it then becomes even more easy to work your way through and far less intimidating as a reader to begin reading. We've heard already about acronyms, and so try and avoid new or specialist acronyms. And obviously, if you do have to use them, and we do when we're dealing with technical subjects, define them more than once, so you don't run into this problem of reviewers saying, "Oh, what on earth does that mean?" So make sure you redefine them in every section and relatively regularly, so you don't annoy reviewers having to flick through loads and loads of pages to try and find what something means or to remind them what something means. So you're trying to avoid what we would call, I suppose, alphabet soup by using curious acronyms that not everyone will understand. And allied to that, limit the use of overly technical language, jargon, and buzzwords. Again, quite difficult when we're working in technical disciplines and obviously clinical medicine, nursing, midwifery, public health, social care. We all have our own set of language that we use and really in a very natural way to us. But in fact, when you step in from outside and you're reading these things, you don't necessarily know. Interestingly, we had an application recently that came from a sort of architecture planning world. And it was just written in a different language. They used the same terms, but in slightly different ways. And we've gone through a whole interpretation system or interpretation process to try and turn that language that's suited to one world into language that an applied health research panel would understand. So be very aware of the world in which you sit and the terms that you use quite happily every day that other people may find difficult. Again, we heard from the panel the importance of consistency. So consistency between sections. I quite like this idea of meandering objectives. Quite often people will state some objectives and then they'll sort of whittle on for a while. And then when it comes to the method section, strangely, those objectives have changed slightly. But actually, it's changed the whole notion of how you go about something. So make sure that you use the same language in the same in different places. So a reviewer gets to recognize it and then to see it reappear and they know exactly what you mean. But meandering objectives is just an example of how things can change in their meaning and then it just leads you off in a different direction. But it's equally the case with when you talk about things. When in the example earlier we talked about obesity, well, what do you mean by obesity? And if later on you refer to overweight, do you mean obesity or do you mean something different? Similarly, in use of terms like directorate or unit or ward, if you're talking about a ward, then you refer to a unit. Do you mean the unit or the ward? so be careful and be very consistent in your use of terms. Here's another literary interlude for you. There was Eru, the one, who in Ada is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Aina, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. It is the Silmarillion, but given that you knew that it was the Silmarillion, you've probably read the Silmarillion, so you'll know that actually having a family tree, a map, a glossary is pretty essential reading for it. So, Melkor or Morgoth, I don't know. He changes his name all the time. Another aspect of style is to be logical. And I suppose this does relate to the consistency element that I was talking about earlier, but it's also about streaming your arguments in a logical way. So your sentences, paragraphs, and sections all flow seamlessly and beautifully to enhance the argument that you're trying to make. And obviously, it's important that you don't contradict yourself. Again, something that our panel pointed out earlier. So don't say something in the plain summary that isn't picked up in the scientific summary, that isn't picked up in the main research plan section. And just a couple of examples of nonsense that you need to avoid in your grant applications. And again, we had an example from the panel this morning, spelling mistakes. Don't spell your name wrong on the first page. Whilst, it doesn't necessarily mean you've written a really bad research grant application. It does give a very poor first impression, as I hope my first slide today for this session illustrated to you. You begin to think, well, who is this person? Do I really want to give them £500,000? They've done this in a terrible rush. Or do you know what? They're just a bit sloppy. So do make sure that you proofread or get others to proofread. If you have difficulties writing, make sure someone else is reading your application as well. Get your co-applicants involved to make sure that what is written is professionally presented and it won't irritate reviewers from the outset. Often we're told, avoid repetition. We haven't got enough words to repeat things. But in fact, if you have key messages that you want to convey to reviewers, bearing in mind that not all reviewers will read every section in a grant application, do repeat your key messages. And this is an example from the CDF I talked about earlier. In the scientific summary, it talks about extensive prior work. In relevant expertise and experience, my preliminary results already show. In the introduction, extensive prior work. In the background, there's a heading prior work. At the end of the research plan, it talks about an existing system prototype. Prior work again in any prior work. And then in ethics issues, first prototypes development. In the IP section, existing diagnostic system prototype. The message that is being got across here is that we've done a lot of groundwork already. This project will be successful. And that is what you want the reviewer to pick up. Keep what you write memorable. And there's a kind of magic number 7 in psychological circles where people can kind of hold on to 7 things at once, but after that, it's just too much. Don't have bullet points, for example, that go on for more than 7. And you can chunk sort of information together so people can remember it. So this is an example for the objectives of a systematic review, what it will include. And there are 4 main things that it's going to include, and that's another example of a successful DRF in this instance. Keep it formal, so avoid abbreviations that might be used in informal writing like don't and shan't and will, and avoid informalities and over-personalization. I think I and we obviously is how we write nowadays, and the BMJ will probably tell you how to write like that, but not things like I'm not convinced. Obviously let the evidence speak for itself. But in terms of plain English summary, if colloquialisms or analogies or metaphors will help people understand, you can of course use them there. Now, some helpful writing techniques. I've already alluded to this magical writing technique known as Cert Justify. I think as writers, indeed writers of academic papers, we tend to build up to the finale, which is zapped in the last sentence of our paragraph. This is not how we write grant applications. You have your key messages at the start of the paragraph. You're making an assertion, like this area of work is under-researched, or this model, previous models simply haven't worked. You're then justifying it with the evidence. So you're drawing on the literature, explaining that in fact this is the case, rather than arguing a case and concluding, which, as I say, is what we tend to do with, for example, writing academic papers. It provides simple and direct communication. You can actually lift those assertions out, very helpful summaries, and it means that speed readers will, if they're only reading the first sentence in each paragraph, will pick up on everything actually you want them to know. So things like current therapies do not address this area, previous work is limited and lacks methodological rigor. This program of work will address prior deficiencies. These are all assertions which you then go on to justify. Another literary interlude for you, some famous assert justifies. One useful thing to do is when you're putting something together, say you've done your background section, is to ask yourself, if a speed reading reviewer reads only the first sentence in each paragraph, will they get the message? Okay, so it's a good exercise to do with your background section to see whether your story is strong. This is an example, again, Antonia's example, and it was in her expertise and experience section, which I don't think is in the fellowship application anymore. But if we look at what she's writing here, so first she's talking about she's developed her career in biomedical research, building on her expertise in signal processing. She's saying, I already have a career in this area, so I know what I'm talking about. She talks about after my BSc in applied maths and PhD, I took a postdoctoral position. I am well qualified, is what she's saying. My supervisors encouraged me to become independent early on. I am an independent researcher. My results have been published in peer-reviewed medical, biomedical, and engineering journals and presented here and there. I have a good research track record. I have already successfully supervised 2 PhDs. I'm already involved in research capacity development. And then she talks about organising a workshop with international colleagues. I have international collaborators in this novel field. And then she talks about her preliminary results. This project is likely to succeed. Now, if we were to look at the instructions for reviewers, or indeed the instructions for people constructing this section, basically she hits all the criteria. So in her first sentences of her paragraphs in this section, she is immediately getting reviewers to tick their boxes. The first one is the first criteria is about they should know what they're talking about, that they're well qualified, that they're moving towards independence, that they have a good research track record, that they're involved in capacity development, that they have collaborators and already well networked. And she talks about her prototype again, the success proposition. So, in your first sentences of each of your paragraphs, you can actually get across all the things a reviewer wants to know, and they'll just go through ticking boxes. This is an example of a background section. I just want you to spend a few seconds looking at it and then think about how it might be changed so that it's more of an assert justify. So the important information is conveyed first. So I'll just give you, I don't know, a minute to look at that and see what you think. Okay. Now, I suppose this has been written in a fairly traditional academic way. So it's sort of leading up to what I think is the important point, which is actually here from a grant writing point of view. So the way we would reconstruct that with an assert justify is current early warning scores do not perform well at identifying patients at increased risk of in-hospital death due to numerous deficiencies in the methods used to develop them. And then these were the conclusions of. So the important thing is not that a systematic review was published in 2007. The important thing is that early warning scores do not work very well. And that is what you want to convey to reviewers first and foremost. So that's assert justify. Another useful tip, writing technique is called priming. And it basically gives the reader advanced information to make them more likely to agree with your proposition or to understand why you're doing something. And it is probably how we all write up to a point. But for example, if we were to say, well, each year 30,000 people suffer from X, Y, or Z, you're immediately priming a reviewer to wanting to see work done on this area. There's a dearth of evidence concerning, is priming for work later. Data will be gathered using priming perhaps for a later resource request for time for an interview or whatever. Previous relevant work by the co-applicant. Again, you're priming the choice of personnel for the study later on. If you're driving down a motorway, you will see a sign like "Don't drive tired." Um, you can be guaranteed that within a mile or two, you will see a motorway service station. You're being primed to say, oh, hang on a minute, I am tired. And then they're providing you with the motorway services station where you can get yourself a nice cup of coffee. So next time you're going driving, just notice that those services will always follow one of those warning signs. It's a type of priming. Signposting. Now, a lot of grant applications or forms that you fill in can be very complex. Some of them are quite bitty. The NIHR isn't bad, but there are others where you end up seemingly having to break down chunks of your method section, put it in a statistical section or whatever. It's very important then that you can actually signpost people to the right bits of the application. And this works in different ways. Firstly, it can tell the reader sequentially that something important is going to come. So if you say in this section we describe, or we now set out the details of, a speed reader will say, okay, I don't need to read that. It's complicated in its methods, but a detailed reader or a methodologist will say, now I've got to pay attention and look at this. So it allows the different sorts of reader to navigate your application. And it also points out where bits of information that are relevant are perhaps somewhere else, which can be helpful to readers, especially when you have these word count issues. So if everything is explained perfectly in your Gantt chart, you can refer people to them. So signposting can be a very important part of writing grant applications. I've already mentioned linking, these words, these connectives, which are terribly helpful when you're trying to create a smooth argument. So it connects your arguments, it maintains the narrative and therefore the interest in what you're writing. It allows the reader to see the logic of what you're doing clearly, and it counteracts, as I say, some of the bitty bits of grant templates that you get. So, we can talk about this work will answer one aspect of the question. However, there remains the issue of, or furthermore, early evidence research shows, whilst this previous work has shown encouraging results, there are only 2 studies that have looked specifically at this issue. So remember your connectives. They're very useful tools when you're writing your grant application. If we look at this plain English summary by a successful DRF, we can see that he's made very good use of connectives. Another technique, the use of tag phrases and labeling. Early on, I talked about consistency and not confusing the reader by using different terms. This is very similar, but actually as a reviewer of applications, we look at them all the time. If you get hold of some of the slightly more complicated language that perhaps you have to use, like systematic review or early warning score, make sure you're using them in the same way all the way through. So it gives the reviewer a complete understanding. So whenever it turns up, they know what you mean by it, and you're not using some other term that will confuse them. And in a sense, it gives you a sense of entitlement as a reviewer to use those. Certainly when we meet with researchers and talk through their application, sometimes you can start as a reviewer to throw back these terms in a confident way because you know what they're talking about, because firstly they've been well explained to begin with, and they're used in a consistent way throughout the research grant application. I thought it'd be interesting just to see what salesmen are told to do and relate that to what we have to do as grant writers. Firstly, they're told to know your customer. And if we think of that in the grant writing context, well, it's knowing the scope and remit of your funder. It's following the guidance notes, so you're knowing what they want and responding carefully to commissioned calls. So when they've asked for a specific subject to be looked at, you're actually responding and doing what they want. So know what it is that your funder wants you to do. Know your product. So be on top of the literature. Know where what you're offering fits in with this picture and indeed fills an evidence gap in this picture. Acknowledge the problems with existing products. So again, be on top of the literature and know the evidence gap. So what are the deficiencies in prior work? And that is why you're obviously plugging it. Offer a solution to a problem. So produce an intervention or a study which addresses the problem and the limitations of previous interventions or studies. So you are offering a solution to a problem. Say why your product is better than others. So again, know the limitations of other studies and interventions and produce an intervention which addresses those. So you're being quite specific about why what you're doing is better than what's gone before. Hook your customer. We've all heard about the importance of plain English summary at hooking the customer, but also having a sensible title, first impressions, etc. And making a good first impression. No typos in title. Have a great team, a good title, a fantastic plain English summary. Tell a story. So have a logically argued background rationale. Address objections up front. So acknowledge the limitations of your approach and provide mitigation where possible. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But it's far better to be aware of the caveats in your research and to present mitigation for those deficiencies, because no research design is perfect, than to ignore them, because reviewers are actually geared up to pick up all the problems that there might be with research. That's what they're there for. So they won't be impressed if there's something obvious that you've missed and not mitigated, or you've declined to mention in case you make them notice it. They will notice it, believe me. Differentiate yourself, so have a great team, an original idea of project. Listen and respond to the customer. We've already heard about the importance of listening to what reviewers tell you and responding. So next time round or at interview, you respond and sensibly to what they've asked you to do. Dazzle them. So have a great team, have an original idea or project, have a fantastic grant proposal. And finally, in terms of sales pitch, well, I think as academics and clinicians, we're all a bit Dr. Spockish. So we're finding, we want to be very logical and dot all our I's and cross all our T's. But in research grant applications, we do need to access our inner James T. Kirk, because sometimes a feeling is all we humans have to go on. Because when it comes to getting across your enthusiasm, your knowledge, your desire to do a research project, especially when it's a personal fellowship, you do want just that little edge, not too much, but that little edge of enthusiasm and drive. And, this is a really exciting thing and a really important thing that needs to be done. And finally, give yourself time to do a good job. Include everything that they ask for, basically do what they ask for. Get pre-submission reviews from inside and outside your specialty area. So if you are talking in jargon or technical language, someone will tell you, actually, if you're a generalist, you won't understand what you're talking about. And keep tweaking, adjusting and redrafting until your application is truly a thing of beauty. And you can see that all great masters try and develop things in a very gradual way before producing a masterpiece.